Okay, so now we're going to assume that the market has numerous, many utility maximizing consumers rather than just one person coming to the market with their fixed income. All right? The price changes and income changes are going to affect everybody similarly, though maybe not exactly. And not exactly because maybe people have slight differences in their preferences. Some people might like oranges better. Some people might like apples better. Some people might, we're going to see, the good might be normal for them. When their income goes up, they buy more of the good. But for some goods, we're going to see that the reverse might be true. And we're going to think about the implications of that. So in switching to this market model, it's going to open up some broader effects or changes that might take place. It's going to complicate things a little bit. And we're not going to go back and try to derive everything explicitly with the indifference curves and budget constraint model. That can be done. It will be done in an intermediate microeconomics course, but we're not going to do any more with that here. We're just going to forward and see where we get. Okay, and like I just said, we're going to complicate the model by introducing many more economic variables that may affect demand for a particular good in the marketplace. Okay, so let's start to do that. All right, demand determinants for a good. And here I want to emphasize the fact that we are talking in this class always, or almost always, we're going to be talking about one particular product or good that's being brought to the market and consumed or demanded by consumers. Now, sometimes I'll give a name to the good, like coffee, or I'll give you, like in the Edgeworth boxes, we'll talk about bread and butter, or we'll talk about wine and cheese. So we'll have different products, but we're always, when we're talking about demand, not talking about demand for everything, but talking about demand for a specific particular product in question. And then we'll just make up a name for some representative product that we're using to describe this particular thing. All right, now this page is going to gives you a list of all of the determinants of demand that we're going to walk our way through and describe. So the most important determinant is going to be the own price, we call it. So that's the price of the good in question itself. So if the demand we're talking about is for coffee, then the own price is going to be the price of coffee in the marketplace, the price of the product itself. All right, and we're going to distinguish that from two other prices down here. The price of substitute goods, goods that you might use instead of using coffee or drinking coffee during the morning. And that would be things like tea and juice, or the price of complementary goods, which would be goods you use together with coffee, as some people do with putting sugar and cream in their coffee, for example. So we've got the own price, but we've also got prices of alternative goods that could be purchased instead. And we're going to think about the relationship with those. We've got the income variable, which affects individual demand. And so we're going to add that up across the entire community. And now we're going to be thinking about income as average household income in the entire community. It's like market income, overall, not just for an individual when we start talking about market demand. Okay, we got some other variables listed here, like T for tastes. This is kind of like utility. You're getting utility because you like coffee, and some people like coffee more than others. And so we might want to represent those stronger or weaker desires for coffee by incorporating another variable into the mix, like T for tastes. Now this one's problematic because there's no way to measure your tastes or how much you like oranges versus apples compared to another person. But we're going to throw it in there just so that we can sort of imagine situations where, maybe advertising suddenly opens up your eyes to a product that you might now desire and want. We could represent that with a shift or an increase in the taste variable. The strength of desire for that product is increasing. All right, and so we're going to think about the implications of that. Now, these next two are really ambitious additions that are often presented in principles courses. But it's the future price of the product, coffee, and it's the future income that you expect as an individual and then gets summed up across the entire community. Now, when we introduce these particular terms, we're actually introducing some dynamics to the model, because dynamics means we're introducing time. And by introducing time, we're imagining that people are not just thinking about their desires today, but they're thinking about their potential to purchase goods tomorrow. You can wait and not buy coffee today, you could buy it tomorrow. And you might do that if you expect that the prices for the product might change noticeably between today and tomorrow, or today and next month, or next year. And the same thing is going to be true for people's income. Your income in the future might affect your desire to purchase a good today. If you know you're coming into a bunch of money because you just are starting a job and income is going to start rolling in next month, well, you might start purchasing things now in anticipation of being able to pay for it next month. All right, so this is a little bit complicating, but it's not too hard to throw into our demand function, which we're going to do. Lastly, the last term here is the number of coffee consumers in the marketplace. And this is going to be representing the size of the market by number of people that are coming to purchase the product. That's going to affect the overall market demand. It's not going to affect the individual demand because we're just adding up the total individuals. All right, let's put this together. Here's my handwritten version of a demand function. All right, and we're going to first talk about this in general, and then we're going to talk about a specific example of this, a linear version of a demand curve like this that we can actually work with and graph and play with it. All right, so first of all, I want to make again the distinction between individual and market demand. And one technique I'm going to use, sometimes I forget to do this, but if I want to talk about individual demand for a product, I will often use the little variable q. So q, diminutive, small, meaning it's just one individual in the marketplace. But if I want to think about the entire market for a product, all of the coffee bought and sold or purchased in the US economy, then I'm going to use the variable q. And q is going to be equal to the sum of all the individual little q's. Mathematically, we put this sigma sign and say we're adding up all of the q's across all the individuals, and it's the market demand for a particular product. Okay, so go back up here. Sometimes I'll write the demand function, and instead of using q, I'll use the term or variable d. We can name our variables whatever we want to name them as long as we specify what the variables refer to, and then the reader can follow it. But to make it a little bit clearer, sometimes I'll write it as qd because q represents quantity and d is demand, and then that will be distinguished from something like QS later on, which is going to be the quantity supplied in the market by the individual firms. Okay, or we might equivalently use the term S to represent supply, and that would be another variable that we might use to measure the quantity. All right, again, just take note at the start of a problem what terms are being used or what variables are being used for different things, and take note that sometimes they change slightly. All right, now here I've got written that the quantity demanded is a function. And that just means it's dependent upon a bunch of other variables. And there would be maybe some functional form, some way of writing this equation that incorporates all of these variables with the sensitivities and the effects that it might have upon the quantity demanded. Again, big Q, so we're talking about the market demand for a particular product. All right, now, next to each of these variables, which I just defined briefly in the page before, I've got a plus or a minus sign up above it. And that plus or minus is meant to represent whether it's a positive relationship with the quantity demanded or whether it's a negative relationship. Okay, so first, own price. We imagine, and we showed diagrammatically, that if the price of a good goes up, that the quantity demanded over here on the left-hand side is going to go down. Higher prices, lower quantity demanded for a good. That's the standard demand relationship that we're going to plot and we're going to work with. All right, but now income. Household income, HH, for households. Household income, I, could have a positive or negative relationship for the product itself. And let me talk a little bit about this particular distinction. If the term has a positive relationship, like I said before, we're going to call that a normal good. So if when the household's income increases, people go out and buy more of the product because they have more money, well, that's normal. It's a typical situation we expect to find. But suppose it's the opposite. How would that come about? Here we use the term inferior to refer to a negative relationship between income and the quantity demanded in the market. So let me explain that. So that would mean that if income goes up and the good is inferior, then people are going to demand less of it. So you have more money to spend, but you spend less on a particular product. Now, the term inferior means something here. We're saying that products that satisfy this condition are not so good. They're not something that people really want to have in their possession. They would rather have something else. There might be something better, but that something better might be more costly. So you're not going to move to that something better unless or until you have more income. And then you're going to give up the cheap goods, the inferior goods, and you're going to buy more of the superior goods, the better goods, which might be considered the normal goods instead. All right, and so a classic example of this might be, there's lots of different beer qualities, for example. There's the cheap beer that you can buy, the Budweiser Light, and so forth, and that's really inexpensive at the store. But then there's all sorts of craft beers that a consumer can purchase instead. And if your income is low, well, you might be stuck wanting to drink beer but purchasing the cheap beer instead. But as your income goes up, because you get a more lucrative job, let's say, you're now going to give up the cheap beer and you're going to move to craft beer, let's say, instead. So that means that as your income rises, your demand for the inferior good, the cheap beer, is going to go down. You're going to demand less of it because you're going to substitute for a better product instead. All right, and that's the rationale. There are a fair number of goods which can be considered to be inferior, and we imagine that individual demand will go down when income goes up instead. Now, keep in mind the following, too. Different people might react differently to the same product. So some individuals might actually find, they might just want to purchase cheap beer and that's all they like. They don't really like the craft beer. So when their income goes up, they buy more cheap beer. So for them, that individual, the product will be a normal good. But that same product for another person might be an inferior good. Those kinds of differences can exist in the real world, and we should recognize that. Here, however, we're talking about household income. We're talking about the measurement of income across the entire community and the effect on market demand. So we want to think about, on average, or across the entire group of individuals in a market, would most of them tend to think it's inferior, or would most tend to think it's normal? Okay, most of the time, you're not going to have to figure that out. I will give you some indication about whether, the product is inferior or normal, and then that's going to determine which direction this relationship works in. Okay, next two things. Prices of substitutes and prices of complements. Okay, a substitute good for coffee would be tea. And just let's do the thought exercise real quick. Suppose the price of your substitute good, like you're, let's say, basically pretty indifferent. To keep the story simple, you're pretty indifferent between drinking coffee or drinking tea in the morning. And let's say, some mornings you go in and buy coffee, and some mornings you go in and buy tea, and you mix it up. Okay, so that's sort of your consumption pattern. Now, let's suppose one day you walk into the shop where you purchase your coffee or tea, and you've discovered that the price of tea has gone up by, I'll make a big number, 50%. It's gone up by a lot. All right, well, the price of your substitute for coffee has now gone up. So that's going to incline you to want to purchase less of the higher priced good, tea, and more of the less expensive good now, coffee. So if the price of a substitute goes up, here, PS goes up, then we'd expect the quantity of coffee demanded, the other good, to go up as well. Positive relationship. So we put a plus up here. All right, next, complements. Suppose you have to have sugar and cream in your coffee, or you won't drink coffee at all. Okay, sugar and cream are considered complements to coffee. All right, well, what happens if there's suddenly a big sugar virus that kills off all the sugar crops across the world, and sugar suddenly skyrockets in price? I'm exaggerating the story here, but we expect that the same thing to work out even for small changes in prices. Okay, but let's exaggerate. The price of sugar goes way up, but you need sugar in your coffee or else you're not going to demand coffee, you're not going to want to drink it. But instead of saying, oh, well, just add the sugar, it's free on the side, now the coffee places are saying, okay, you want coffee, it's $3, but you want coffee with sugar, $5. I'm exaggerating. All right, well, what would you do if suddenly your $3 coffee went to $5 because of the sugar price that's incorporated now? Well, we'd expect you to demand less coffee, all right, because it's too expensive to add in the complementary good to your coffee, and your demand is going to go down. Hence, negative relationship between the price of a complementary good and the effect on coffee demand itself. All right, so that's how that works. Tastes or preferences. Positive relationship, and here we just want to indicate that if for some reason your preferences change in a way that makes you desire more oranges, well, you'll demand more oranges. If it rises that you demand more coffee, maybe there's a medical report that comes out that says, hey, you know what, coffee extends your life by 5 years. People say, oh, I better drink more of it. So your tastes for coffee go up because of new information that you might have. All right, and that's how we can incorporate that into the model. If your taste diminished for a product, negative, that T goes down, then the quantity demanded for the product will go down as well. Okay, future prices and income. These are a little bit complicated, but let me explain really briefly. Suppose, let's change the product to gasoline, because that's something you buy, you store for a little while in your car's gas tank, and then you purchase again later on in a couple of days or weeks. Well, suppose you expect that gasoline is going to suddenly increase in price next week, right? And for example, maybe it's going to increase in price because a hurricane is coming through, and you're not sure whether the product is even going to be available, and that the price might be higher next week because of the shortage. Well, what would you do? Your answer is likely to be, well, if I think I'm going to have to pay more next week when I demand gasoline, maybe I better buy more now. So if you expect the future price to be higher, that's going to tend to increase your demand for the product today. And the more the future price goes up, the more you're going to demand and try to store up or stock up on it in the meantime. So positive relationship between the future price and the quantity of a product demanded. Next, future income, also a positive relationship. And here the story is, well, if I think I'm going to make more money next month because I've got a great new job that's going to pay me a bunch more, well, then this month I'm going to go out and I'm going to maybe rent a new apartment, and I'm going to buy some furniture for it, and I'm going to buy some dishes, and I'm going to buy, and it's like I don't have the money right now, but I'm going to have it soon, so I'm going to put it on my credit card, and then I'm going to pay it back in the future. Right? So if your income goes up, then the individual is likely to want to purchase more of the product today. That means your income is expected to go up in the future. So it hasn't happened yet. It's just like thinking that it's going to go up, and that can affect your behavior today. Okay, lastly, number of buyers in the marketplace. That's going to be a positive relationship because more people in the market buying will increase total demand. All right, some things you've got to keep in mind from this whole thing. Normal versus inferior, and recognize substitutes versus complements. Those are important distinctions that have to be remembered from this relationship.